So you've decided to get more serious about gaming. For most people, this implies making the transition between just playing the game and seeing what works, to actually studying the systems inside the game and how they work so that you can maximize your advantage. For example, in fighting games, this would mean first learning about what hitboxes are and how startup, active, and recovery frames function. This would allow you to utilize frame advantage to its fullest and really start pushing any player who doesn't. It's not an exact science, but here we could say that a beginner player is someone who just mashes buttons for the hell of it, an intermediate player is one who knows how to execute most combos, but a pro knows the entire frame data and exactly what move should be used when. However, you're not all that big on fighting games, are you? No, judging by the title of the video you clicked on, you're much more into first-person shooters. So let's take a look at what systems you should know about if you want to start playing more like a pro, beginning with one of the most common terms used in this genre, Hitscan. To put it simply, Hitscan is one of the methods that many FPS games use to simulate the use of projectile weapons. It has 3 basic steps to it. First, the game takes note of the direction in which the weapon is pointing. Then, at the moment when the shot is fired, it casts a straight line from the weapon to where you were pointing it. And finally, a shot is registered with the first object that the line comes into contact with. That's the basics of it, at least. We have some deviations depending on the type of weapon used. For example, when certain weapons like railguns or sniper rifles cast these straight lines, they register hits not only with the first object the line comes into contact with, but also the second, or sometimes even more. The game uses this expanded formula to make certain weapons more powerful by allowing them to shoot through certain surfaces or even hit multiple enemies at once. Kinda like Deadpool when he's down to his last bullet. And since we've already mentioned surfaces, we should note that this formula also takes the type of surface into account in most games. This way, your shot can shatter glass, but not go through walls. And if the surface is reflective enough, it could even ricochet. When a shot ricochets off a reflective surface, a new line is cast at an angle determined by the angle at which the original line hits the surface. This is pretty much the extent of Hitscan. It's a method that simulates the firing of projectiles, mostly bullets. So now that we have a grasp on how this method actually works, we have to ask ourselves whether this is a good way to simulate firearms. If you paid close attention to the exact syntax we've used, then you may already be able to spot one of the perceived shortcomings of Hitscan, and that's the lack of realism. Namely, this method does not take the actual bullet into the equation. There are no bullets. You point a gun, you click to fire, the system calculates what the first object is in the straight line pointing from your firearm, and then the hit is registered. The very moment you press the trigger, your bullet has already found its mark. It may not hit where you wanted it to hit, but there is no physical bullet being fired. Not even a theoretical Neo from the Matrix would be able to dodge a shot from a weapon that uses Hitscan, because there are no bullets to dodge in the first place. Sure, real bullets are very fast, but they still take time to travel through space, and they don't follow a perfectly straight line. Their trajectory can be altered by more than just a reflective surface. So for the sake of a ballistic simulation, Hitscan is far from realistic. But is this a bad thing? Well, no. Video games aren't real life. No physics engine is ever going to function like real-life physics, because you would need the king of all supercomputers to calculate everything in real time. And let's face it, if you didn't already know how Hitscan works, you probably didn't think that firearms in video games were so unrealistic either. Games have to consider gameplay balance. This always comes first. Realism is, at best, only a second on the list of priorities. In most games, the distance between players is so small that bullet travel time and trajectory hardly matter, so why bother with them? And even then, there are certain things you can add to the formula to tweak it so that Hitscan may better emulate realistic ballistics combat. As we all know, firing automatic rifles in shooting games lowers their accuracy so as to emulate the recoil the shooter would experience. And long-distance sniping sometimes requires you to aim above the target if you want to hit it. There's still a single line being cast from your sniper rifle, but your aim always goes a bit above this line. So as you can see, there are things you can do to Hitscan to make it not only more balanced, but more realistic as well. Nevertheless, certain weapons simply don't mix well with Hitscan. Think rocket launchers. There's no way that your target would explode the very moment you fire off a rocket launcher. These things take a bit of time to reach their target. So how do developers deal with this, since Hitscan simply can't emulate this weapon in a balanced or realistic manner? Well, they either don't do it at all and the game doesn't feature this weapon, or they utilize projectile ballistics. Just like Hitscan, projectile ballistics is another method of calculating projectile trajectory, only instead of using just a contact point between an object and an invisible line, this time there's an actual physical projectile involved. The game renders an actual in-game projectile that then gets affected by the physics engine. This means that the size and weight of the projectile play a role in its trajectory, as well as velocity, wind, and even some other factors. So when you try to shoot a target in a game that uses projectile ballistics as a means of calculating bullet trajectory, you need to take all of these things into account. And if the target is moving, your job becomes that much harder. So, now that we know how both Hitscan and projectile ballistics work, which one do we think is better? Well, if realism is what you're after, then the answer will have to be projectile ballistics. There's no getting around it. On paper, it's superior to Hitscan in virtually every way, plain and simple. But as we've said, realism isn't the ultimate goal in gaming. So we have to look at some of the disadvantages of projectile ballistics that Hitscan doesn't have. The most important distinction here is that Hitscan is much easier on the hardware. Just think about it. When you fire a shot using projectile ballistics, the bullet gets rendered as an in-game object, and because it can be affected by the physics engine, the trajectory requires a much more complex calculation. This isn't as big a deal in single-player games, but in multiplayer games, you really don't want to put the server under this kind of strain. Not if you want a smooth gameplay experience. And that's not even taking into account weapons that use rapid fire, where you would have to add the recoil effect onto an already complex calculation. The user experience wouldn't look any different from what Hitscan already gives us, but it would mean hell for the CPU. So which one of these do developers go with? Well, they kinda go for both. That's the great thing about these simulation methods. They aren't mutually exclusive. There are certain titles that use just one. For example, older games that don't feature as diverse an arsenal of weaponry most likely rely only on Hitscan, while other games like Sniper Elite and the Max Payne series utilize projectile ballistics throughout. Still, the vast majority of developers nowadays opt for the hybrid approach. In this case, most weapons use Hitscan, but projectile ballistics is also used for the weapons that require it the most. Again, we have the rocket launcher to thank for being such a good example of a weapon that projectile ballistics was simply made for. And since you can't really use the rocket launcher on rapid fire, the CPU can handle this just fine. Generally speaking, high damage weapons that have noticeable reload times and can fire only one shot at a time get the projectile ballistics treatment, while others get the full benefits of Hitscan. This also means that in a hybrid system like this, sniper bullets will be subject to the physics engine, while gun and rifle bullets won't, which has huge implications on game balance. So if you're a certified Hawkeye with the rifle, but you tend to miss when using the sniper rifle, this may be the reason. It could be that the two weapons operate under entirely different systems in the game. This is something that pro players are very much aware of, so you need to know it too if you want to stand a chance in the upper tiers of play. And that about does it for today's video. To summarize, Hitscan and projectile ballistics are two methods of simulating bullet trajectory. We use the term bullet here to loosely refer to all types of ammunition, bananas included. The latter places a much higher emphasis on realism, but the former has the benefit of being way less hardware demanding. Knowing the ins and outs of these two methods and recognizing which weapon uses which in your favorite online shooter is the first step towards becoming a better player. In any case, we hope you found this video helpful. If you have, you can help us out by liking it and subscribing to our channel. And if you've got friends who could benefit from this info, help them out by sharing this video, either directly or on social media. Also, if you want want to see more videos like this one, we highly recommend you click on the bell icon so that you'll get a notification whenever a new video drops. We're constantly working on new content for you guys, so keep your eyes peeled for the next one. In the meantime, may your games be fun and your losses few. And as always, we'll see you next time on Gaming Scan.